Chapter 17. Training's End. For the next few days, Joe could barely remember what it felt like not to be exhausted and covered in bruises. Wilson took their training absolutely seriously. He refused to pal around with Joe as he usually did, treating her as his student and nothing more. He only used enough soul each day to elevate his own strength and speed to Joe's level, and yet Joe was constantly surprised by how capable he was at outmaneuvering her at every turn. At the start of their training, Joe had still had doubts about Wilson's assertion, but seeing him dance circles around her, she couldn't deny it anymore, even to herself. She never lost to Wilson outright, but she never beat him either, and it didn't take her long to realize that if she fought one of the other dueling hearts in a fight without soul, she would likely be outmaneuvered by them as well. In fact, the gap between herself and one of her friends would likely be even wider. So she did as Wilson instructed and focused on letting her body move the way that felt best, just as she had toward the end of her fight with Karen. It wasn't an easy process, but on the morning of the third day, she started to get the hang of it. She found that when she needed to move, more times than not, she just moved. Joe was never unaware of her movements, but she didn't have to think about them either, and her reactions became much faster. By the morning of the fourth day, she was able to keep up with Wilson despite his greater experience. By that evening, she was able to consistently break through his guard on the merits of speed alone without focusing her soul even once. As their fourth day of training came to an end, as Joe prepared to be dismissed, Wilson began pacing the room and said something that she didn't expect. "It would seem," he began, choosing his words carefully, "that the first phase of your training to master this skill is complete." "That's great," Joe responded, excited. "It is," Wilson agreed. "You're advancing as quickly as I had dared hope that you would. The issue now is that we must test your new abilities with your soul making you faster. At greater speeds, you'll naturally take more care in your movements, and trusting your muscle memory to move your body for you will become more difficult. You need to spar with someone using soul. It's the only way we'll know if you've mastered this state of mind. But I, unfortunately, cannot generate enough soul to challenge you at that level without risking my health." "There are the other dueling hearts," Joe suggested. "Yes," Wilson agreed, "but I had hoped to keep them to their regular training for as long as possible. Your sister in particular needs all the time and energy that she can get to work through her own disadvantage. It looks like we don't have a choice. Your training can't continue right up to the day of the rematches anyway. You'll need time to rest and recover before the Soul Takers show themselves again." He nodded, having come to a decision. "All right," he announced. "Tomorrow, rather than our regular training, you will spar with the other dueling hearts. Then, provided that you're able to utilize your new skills at full speed, all four of you will be dismissed until the day of the rematch. I'll let the others know once they arrive tomorrow. Don't worry about coming in early. Instead, plan to arrive when the others do." Joe nodded. She was getting excited. She felt stronger than she ever had before, and regardless of what life-threatening challenge waited around the corner, she was looking forward to showing her friends how far she'd come. She went home feeling genuinely happy about her situation. She was nervous about fighting Karen again, of course, but she felt sure that she was armed with everything she needed to win that fight, and she was hyped. A few minutes later, Joe almost skipped through the front door of her house. She threw open the door, knocking it against the stopper, causing it to bang and rattle loudly. She was surprised to hear a loud shushing noise from the living room as a response. Her attention piqued. She stepped inside to see what was going on. There she found Shannon, a sleeping Sarah covered in a flannel blanket, leaning sound asleep against her mother's shoulder. Joe couldn't have stopped herself from smiling if she had tried. It was clear now that it had been Shannon who had called for Joe's quiet. She looked over her shoulder, smiled at Joe, and explained, "She wore herself out with training. I convinced her to sit down, and she was out just like that." "She was training here?" Joe asked, as she sat down in the armchair across from her mom. "Yeah, for once," Shannon replied. "I'm not sure why." Shannon looked over at her sleeping youngest daughter and beamed at her with a melancholic smile. "I'm surprised that she was willing to train at home before she figured out how to control life energy." Joe almost choked. "You know about that?" Shannon met Joe's eyes and raised an eyebrow. "Of course I know. I know enough about life energy and how it can be used to know when someone can't use it at all." "So you know what this is?" Joe asked. "You know why she can't do it?" Shannon looked away. "No, I don't. I've never heard of anything like this. It could be some inherent property of her soul, something that can't be overcome. What's most likely, though, is that she's experiencing something akin to a mental block, and that she'll overcome it with time all on her own. I can't be sure, but I know that she's ashamed of this, so I haven't brought it up. I was hoping that I could come up with a solution before mentioning it to her." Shannon didn't say it, but Joe could tell that, as ashamed as Sarah was by her handicap, Shannon was ashamed that she couldn't fix it for her. "I believe that she can do it," Joe told her mom. Shannon was surprised. "Oh, no, don't get me wrong. So do I. If it's possible to work through whatever this is, Sarah can do it." Shannon sounded sincere. Joe could tell that she meant what she said, but upon hearing it, Joe shook her head. "No, Mom. I know she can do it, even if it isn't possible. It's like you always say, soul allows us to tap into the metaphysical, to change the world, and even, if we're strong enough and dedicated enough, to do the impossible. Shannon chuckled. I guess I do say that sometimes. It's really just something I use on the kids to get them pumped up for lessons. But hearing you say it, it's like hearing it again for the first time. I can actually believe that it's true. The two sat in silence for a few long seconds. Joe felt a sudden urge to unload on her mom about everything that had been going on and tell her all about the Soul Takers. She longed to hear her mother say that everything was going to work out fine and that no one would get hurt and that everything wasn't completely different for Joe and the rest of the Dueling Hearts now. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't give her mom such a huge thing to worry about, not when Joe was capable of worrying about it for the two of them. Instead, Joe stood up and said, I'm glad she fell asleep. She and I are going to spar tomorrow at Wilson's, and I want her to beat her best. Joe stretched out her back a bit. Even sitting for those few minutes had left her feeling stiff. Then she bent down and she scooped her sister up in her arms. I'll take her up. Okay, Shannon replied, shooting Joe a warm, motherly smile. Joe walked carefully up the stairs, pushed Sarah's doorway door open gingerly with her foot, walked inside and set her sister gently onto the bed. She didn't get to see her sister like this often. Asleep, Sarah didn't wear any of the characteristic annoyance, anger, or worry that usually marred her soft features. She looked peaceful and carefree. Seeing her like that made Joe think about the Soul Takers again, to really think about them and how powerful they were. She felt like someone had grabbed her around the heart. She was desperately afraid for her sister, and while the sensation passed a moment later, purposely set aside, it left an impression. Looking at Sarah, so calm and innocent, Joe felt the need to protect her, something that she hadn't been able to do the last time, and probably wouldn't be able to do at the rematch either. This battle was going to be as hard as the last, if not harder, and Sarah had no choice except to stand on her own. While Joe believed in her sister as much now as ever, she wished that the situation were different. She'd felt this way since their training had begun, but only now was she allowing herself to acknowledge it. In that moment, Joe made a vow. Her sister might not even need protection, and Joe might not be able to give it, but she would do her best from this point forward to protect her sister, and her friends, and everyone else who needed her help for as long as she could. She smiled down at her sister one more time, and then turned and left the room, shutting the door behind her. She made her way back downstairs. Her mom wasn't in the living room anymore. Joe didn't know where she was, but she didn't mind. She didn't need any more opportunities to let slip what was going on in her life. She walked to the kitchen and fished some leftovers from dinner out of the fridge, heated them up, and ate, taking her time. Then, when she was finally finished, despite that it was still relatively early, she went straight to bed. Joe's nightmares returned that night. The cold, the sense of something creeping up on her from eternal darkness with that cold at its back. It continued on throughout the night, playing over and over, the same as ever, but this time there was one key difference. As the dream went on, Joe became aware of a third presence there with her at her side. As that presence emerged, the cold became warmth, and the darkness receded, replaced by light. Joe felt someone take her hand and stand with her in case the dark and the cold should return. Just before she was able to look over and see who it was, she woke up. Joe looked over at her bedside clock. It was near enough to her regular wake-up time that she decided to just stay awake. She was used to her odd dreams, but something about this latest one had left her shaken in a way that her nightmares never had before. The thought of returning to it made her shudder. It had been a couple of days since her last decent grooming experience, so Joe decided to take a quick shower to help wash the unsettling feeling away. Unfortunately, it didn't really work. As she got dressed and headed off to Wilson's, she was still out of sorts, so much so that she didn't even bother to wait and see if Sarah wanted to walk with her. Joe arrived at Wilson's almost before she realized it. Jen and Tucker were already there, with Sarah arriving only a few minutes behind her, giving her a quizzical look. Seeing the Dueling Hearts all together, Joe was reminded that she was supposed to test her new abilities against them today. She focused on that, and the thought of a good fight finally pushed the memory of her dream out of mind. Wilson explained to the others exactly what he and Joe had been training together to do. Sarah already knew, but Jen and Tucker didn't, and they found Wilson's assessment of Joe's weakness to be rather interesting. Jen, of course, would have mastered this ability a long time ago. Joe could recognize that now. It was the only way that Jen could possibly fight so effectively while also putting such effective, multi-stage strategies together on the fly. And likewise, Tucker, who didn't overthink anything, would likely have a grasp on this skill as well, developed naturally over his time training with Soul. Joe and Sarah had discussed the topic. While Sarah was unsure if she possessed this ability herself, Joe was sure that she wasn't far off from it at the very least. That meant that, in terms of this particular skill, Joe had been behind the others for quite some time. She wasn't quite proud enough to say it out loud when she wasn't trying to get a rise out of anybody, but she had already been able to outmaneuver the other Dueling Hearts before. She looked forward to seeing how far her training had widened that gap. Wilson explained that it was imperative that Joe's response times be pushed to the limit. and so he wanted her to fight against all 3 of the other dueling hearts at once, and focus specifically on avoiding their attacks without retaliating. Though they found Wilson's instructions to be a little odd, Sarah, Jen, and Tucker surrounded Joe at 3 points. Jen, always thinking ahead, positioned herself behind Joe, aiming to catch her off guard, but Joe had something special planned to surprise her cousin when she tried that. As the fight started, Sarah hung back to look for an opening, but Tucker, of course, moved immediately. He surged forward, heat rolling off of him as he charged his muscles with soul. Joe took a half step back, her arms held ready to defend, as Tucker unleashed a flurry of blows so fast that they could barely be seen. She reacted without thought, dodging each strike using the simplest movement possible and the least amount of effort. She didn't have to deflect even a single blow, and as Tucker pressed, Joe even had the mental bandwidth to mix her energies, surrounding herself in her glittering, healing aura. She did so just in time for the life energy rolling off of her aura to bounce off of Jen's energies. Joe was able to feel Jen coming at her from behind, prepared to strike. Smiling, Joe felt herself respond to that sixth sense as readily as her sight. She slid her foot into Tucker's shadow, allowing her to shadow step behind him, leaving behind a latent image in her place just as Tucker threw a particularly powerful punch, and just as Jen's attack was about to connect. They both realized at the last second what Joe had done, but it was too late. Their attacks sailed through the fading image, crossed, and they struck each other in the face. It was at that chaotic moment that Sarah saw her opportunity. She surged forward and was suddenly right on top of Joe, twirling around from toe to toe, striking at Joe's head and torso with swift thrusts, backed by the momentum of her turns. Joe ducked and weaved around them, one after another, allowing her healing aura to fade, leading Sarah around in such a way that Joe could see Jen and Tucker behind her. Joe saw the two of them nod at each other, and then launched themselves in different directions, spreading out to either side of the allotted space. They rushed at Joe, Tucker attacking high and Jen attacking low, just as Sarah launched an attack at Joe's core. Joe felt her heel touch the edge of the training mat. If she tried to step back further, she would find herself against the dojo wall, and that was a disadvantage that she couldn't allow. With hardly any room to maneuver, Joe's body reacted. She jumped up and twisted her body at an angle. Tucker's strike sailed over her and Jen's strike sailed under. The two shifted, intending to launch follow-up strikes at where Joe hung helpless in the air, but that's when Sarah struck. Joe caught her sister's fist in her hand and pulled, yanking Sarah forward, close enough for Joe to grab her shoulder and vault clear over the much smaller girl. Sarah stumbled forward and smacked into the wall. Meanwhile, Joe flipped once and landed firmly on both feet, shuffling back to the center of the training area. Even Joe was impressed with how well she was doing. Wilson hadn't called for the end of the match yet, so she pressed on, with Sarah picking herself back up, and she, Jen, and Tucker turning again to face Joe. This time they all attacked together, but Joe wove around what strikes she could and deflected the rest. Not a single attack connected. She was moving so fast that, to an outside observer, her body seemed to distort, to curl around the attacks being leveled against her, and then, as the pace of her opponent's attacks picked up, the entire top half of her body almost seemed to disappear, replaced by a swirling of hair and limbs. This wasn't effortless for Joe, though, even if she did make it seem that way, so before long she shadow-stepped again, leaping in an instant to the far side of the fight area. She skid to a stop, breathing just as heavily as Jen, Tucker, and Sarah were as they ceased their assault. Still, Joe was impressed with herself, and while her friends were impressed as well, for sure, she could also see how frustrated they were getting, making Joe smile. "That's enough," Wilson said from his place at the front of the room, addressing Joe's three opponents. "Given more time, the three of you would certainly overwhelm Miss Seeker, especially were you to use your more specialized techniques. But she has more than proven herself." Then to Joe, he said, "I don't know if I would say that you've mastered this ability yet. I don't know if I'd ever say that, as one can always grow stronger. But you've come further than I could have hoped in so short a time. Keeping ahead of someone like Karen will still be difficult. She still has an understanding of how you move that's second only to your own. But now you should be able to challenge her in close quarters without being immediately outclassed." Wilson looked each of the dueling hearts in turn, his gaze thoughtful, and he said, "You have all grown so much stronger over these 2 weeks. You've pushed yourselves and expanded your understanding of what you are capable of. I don't know if you even realize how much you've grown," he remarked, "but whether you do or not, don't think that the upcoming battle will be any easier than the last. You're still lacking in experience using the techniques that I've taught you. That won't be the case for your opponents, and you have no idea how far your opponents can continue to push themselves beyond what they displayed in your last exchange. Under no circumstance should you take them lightly." "Way to kill the mood," Tucker protested, still defiant, still pushing back against Wilson's tutelage. Wilson frowned at him. "I'm sorry if the reality of the situation fails to put you at ease. I understand that the 4 of you enjoyed challenging yourselves, and that is perfectly fine, but this is not the situation for that. Your futures at the least, and your lives at the worst, are on the lines in this contest. I will not allow you to not take this fight seriously. Do you plan to take this fight seriously, Mr. Tucker? Tucker looked Wilson in the eyes, his gaze fierce. Yeah, of course I do. That Lawrence guy beat me worse than I've ever been beaten because I didn't take him seriously. I'm going to fight him again and fix that, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to enjoy myself if I can. Wilson broke eye contact with Tucker. He looked at each of them one last time. I imagine the rest of you feel much the same way. They all nodded affirmation, and Wilson said, Good, then there is nothing more I can teach you, at least not before the Soul Takers return. Go home. Rest, recover, practice any skills that you feel are lacking, but don't overexert yourselves. We will all meet back here 3 days from now at 7 p.m. Once we do, the Soul Takers are unlikely to make us wait for long. Affected by the weight of Wilson's words, the dueling hearts left for the day and went their separate ways. Joe and Tucker made plans to spend some downtime together the following morning, but otherwise the fighters wouldn't assemble again until the time for their rematch had come.